Hey, welcome back to the Cruise Elite podcast. I'm here with Tony. How are you, Tony?
I'm doing good. You can't actually see, but
Oh, Tony has his
Cruise Elite T-shirt.
Yeah, he's got his uniform on.
Yeah, dude, it's a really nice tee.
Nice.
I don't know how many you have in stock, but people should get them. They're like nice and fitted.
It's funny to think about having them in stock because I literally dusted off a cardboard box that was, I don't know, it just got stuffed away when we moved. And so we've got some in there, but I don't know how many. How's it going, dude? I feel like I haven't talked to you in a while. What's new?
Yeah, it has been a bit. So we got kittens. I think we talked about that. But did we talk about that? I don't know. Did we?
I don't think we did. So
we got kittens.
Nice.
And they are just little bundles of joy, you know.
How many kittens?
Awesome. 2.
Okay.
So two siblings. And they came from the same litter. My friend basically, you know, the term cat distribution system. Basically, like a stray cat shows up and starts meowing at the window, and she like lets it in, and then it doesn't leave. And then a couple weeks later, she realizes it was pregnant.
No kidding.
So 5 kittens, and we like went down there, and we were like, we can't take more than 2. We can't take more than 2. But at that age, they're like freaking adorables.
Yeah.
You want to take them all.
Oh, well, that's fun.
Yeah, super exciting. And we've been thinking about it for a long time. We were just like, let's go on like one more trip. Let's like do one more thing where we're not like beholden to caring for another living being. I'm talking about it so dramatically, but I do feel that way.
Hey, if you're going to have pets, you know, you kind of should feel that way.
Yeah, thank you.
You know? Yeah.
Good man. Do you have any pets?
No, we don't. I just have a 3-year-old rascal running around. But yeah, no pets. I grew up with some pets, but I never had a dog, never had cats. It's a funny story. I had rabbits actually.
Okay.
And it was like partially accidental, really. I think the first rabbit I had was like a present around like, you know, Easter. My parents got me a rabbit or something, and we ended up with 2 later on, and then all of a sudden we weren't prepared for like 30 accidentally. So our friends and neighbors had to come to the rescue on that. But yeah, I grew up with rabbits, and other than that, no, not many pets.
Rabbits are like pretty sweet, right? Like they're pretty gentle and
they were actually
affectionate, right?
Yeah, it was kind of a fun little house pet, and we also like had it outside all the time too. But like growing up, I was more running around in the woods catching turtles and frogs, right? And fishing, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'd have a bucket with me, and I'd have frogs in the bucket and turtles, and I'd carry them around for a day and then let them go again, and do the whole thing over again the next day.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I'm a city kid, so like my version of that was like, oh, I caught like a cricket and a firefly, but
yeah. All right, man. So, what are we doing? What are we talking about?
Yeah, so last episode, we talked about the process of taking a history.
Mm-hmm.
And you outlined kind of your process, why you do it, what steps you go through, and some interesting things to look for when you're taking a history and why it's so important for your practice.
Yeah.
And so I think that's an amazing episode. And if you haven't listened to it yet, definitely go back and listen to it before you listen to this one, because it really sets the stage. But I thought it would be really cool to give people a seat at the table while you're taking a history so that they can really see what it's like, the kinds of questions you ask, the kind of follow-up questions you ask. And I am excited to offer myself up as a guinea pig for this. And so I figure you can just kind of do your normal process, and then here and there I can ask questions, meta questions outside of, being the client.
Right.
And just give people a sense of what that process is really like, both for your, NeuroDojo students who might be, applying this with their own clients or with themselves, and people at home that just want to better understand how history really does affect what their present day relationship with pain and movement might be.
Yeah, that's great. Good stuff. So this will be kind of cool actually for our current NeuroDojo students, I think, because we cover so much theory in the course. We're currently going over the vestibular system right now, so it's a lot of information. And I will always sort of interject in these lectures and be like, oh, and by the way, from a history taking perspective, you need to be listening for this. So, like, for example, when we were talking about the vestibular system on yesterday's call, I told everybody very briefly, when you're interested in talking to somebody and you have suspicion that maybe the vestibular system is going to be an important thing that you want to do some training with or at least assess, be listening for things like, I have chronic back pain, I have chronic neck pain, stuff like that, because a lot of times, that is going to be connected to vestibular health. So there's a lot of connections that you can learn through listening to somebody and their history. And it's such an important part of the craft if you're a movement professional. But I always feel like we are never doing it justice enough and putting enough time into understanding how to take a history and what to listen for. So this will be kind of cool for those students too. So this is great. I think to start, what I generally do with people, because at this point, most people who are doing sessions with me and seeking me out are individuals that have very specific goals. Most of the time, those goals seem to be pain related. They've tried a bunch of things. They need some help on trying to overcome a movement problem and a pain issue. Usually it's both. However, sometimes I work with like athletes and they have the goal of just getting healthier, maintaining good health during their athletic career, and doing things that can help them move better and feel better and recover faster. So at this point, that's kind of what people are coming to me for. So I often will just start talking about goals with people. So right away, Tony, I would just want to know, like, what goals do you have, if any, right now with your fitness, right? Like, I know that you're a dude who works out.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess what would be cool for me to know is, like, what does your fitness regimen look like? And like, do you have any goals within fitness? Maybe they're fitness goals, health goals. Maybe you want to overcome a limitation or a pain. I'll just kind of let you talk for a couple minutes about that. And then that will kind of help me create some questions.
Yeah. Okay. So many threads to pull on.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that the best place to start would be that, as we talked about before, I injured my knee
Right.
on a jujitsu mat in like the least cool way possible, just by like stepping backwards funny or something.
Mm-hmm.
You should have seen the other guy, um, but that kind of was a real setback, because before that I was, just kind of going through different programs, doing strength training, doing some mobility stuff, and like generally just at that point training to just get stronger and feel good.
Mm-hmm.
And when I injured my knee, that kind of all came to a stop. And to be quite honest, I'm still sort of struggling with finding um, momentum
Mm-hmm.
there, in just terms of like working out and like being consistent,
Mm.
because I do still have some pain. And then when I don't work out as much, it gets worse. Right.
Mm.
And so, yeah, just kind of getting back to that lifestyle that, I felt like I was doing really good before the injury. And then also to combat just kind of postural things. I feel like I'm always at the computer or looking at my phone, and I feel like I'm just like forward tilting a
Mm-hmm.
lot with my posture. So, working out has always been kind of a great antidote for that for me.
Yeah.
And then conditioning. My conditioning's gone to shit.
Mm-hmm.
I notice my strength is, it's not where it used to be, but it's still, you can summon it and it kind of comes back quicker
Yeah.
after, a little bit of stimulus. But man, I'm like breathing harder than I used to.
Mm.
And that's frustrating, especially because I don't feel very comfortable like going for a jog, for example,
Right.
whereas I used to be able to kind of have that in my bag of tricks. So I think that's kind of a good,
Yeah.
place to start.
Well, see, that's why I feel like what you just said is why I ended up kind of in the place I am in as a coach, because you know, as a coach, you want to make an impact, and helping people with fitness is great.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as there's something in the way of that,
Mm-hmm.
now you can't do much, right? And so I think like naturally my interest started shifting towards helping people with their pain issues, because you can't have fitness and the activities that you want, at least in the way that you want to pursue them,
Yeah.
if you have pain issues in the way. So yeah, doing a history, I'm always wondering, you know, what sorts of limitations might be there. And you know, the reality is, and I learned this right away coming out of college and becoming a personal trainer. I might have even said this in a podcast at some point, but when I first jumped into the industry as a personal trainer, 100% of my clients had pain.
Hmm.
And I was like, uh I'm scared. What do I do?
Yeah.
It's like I can help you, you know, with fitness and stuff, but like what am I supposed to do with these people that all have pain? So realistically, everybody usually has something going on,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, rather than working around it forever, trying to figure out some solutions is so important. So yeah, why don't we? Does it make sense to like keep the your knee issue kind of at the forefront of what we're talking about in terms of helping you overcome something?
I mean, I defer to you in terms of what you think is most important, but
Yeah,
as like, in terms of goals, that feels
yeah.
like the thing that I really want to overcome.
And is it keeping you from doing like, because I know you like to strength train, is it actually keeping you from strength training right now? Or are you able to do some things?
No, I can do a lot, and so I
Yeah,
think a lot of it is mental. Um but I haven't been wanting to load it as heavy like in the squat position
yeah.
specifically as I used to. And like some days it's angrier than others. Like even doing so I've been doing incorporating some yoga
Hmm.
into my kind of weekly routine. I've
Hmm.
really been enjoying it. But there's certain positions where you're kind of in like a almost like a sumo squat and you're like
Yeah.
getting your hips way down and your knees are wide out and your toes are wide out, and I'm just kind of like feeling that pressure like
Hmm.
on the ligament, like it kind of wants to like a rubber band that's being pulled too hard or something.
Yeah, yeah.
And it takes me out of it, and I just what I really don't want is to injure it again,
Hmm.
right? Because I do have a lot of movement and I can do a lot, and so it's just a setback would be pretty demoralizing. So I think that's
Yeah.
I think that's a psychological block
Yep.
more than anything, but it's led to me just being less ambitious with my
Right.
training.
I get it, because I actually had a knee injury, I want to say like 7 years ago. And there's a level of confidence that you have to get back before you feel like you can move through the world the way that you want to.
Mm-hmm.
And it took a while for me to gain that last 5% back. And I always remember that, because I was like, man, I know I could go to jujitsu today, but as soon
Mm-hmm.
as we go live, like I don't feel safe anymore. And I was able to do things in a controlled way to keep myself safe. But
Mm-hmm.
then because I didn't have that extra 5% yet, I was really holding back and not going live, because live becomes so unpredictable. I
Yeah.
think it's that unpredictable part of moving that really holds people back. So, okay. So I definitely want to be asking you questions about the knee. Is there anything else that you would want to put on your list for goals/priorities, whether it's fitness or health related?
Yeah, conditioning, getting my knee back to where I'm feeling confident,
Yep.
doing all the movement and strength training I want, and just being consistent.
Okay.
That's where I'm at. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. All right. So right away, as far as the knee goes, did you ever have an official like diagnosis on what might have happened there in terms of, you know, possible tissue damage, stuff like that?
Yeah, so they think it was the posterior cruciate ligament,
Uh huh.
and I think it was, I guess, like sprained, I guess is
Yeah.
the correct term. This is a whole other story, but I definitely felt like when I went to the orthopedist that I
Mm-hmm.
did not get any real clear answers. And it wasn't until I went to a physical therapist that like she was able to kind of give me more information and was pretty confident in what she could assess from the outside, based on her experience, right?
Right. And so they took you through probably like some manual type stability tests and things on the table to kind of get a sense for whether or not it was PCL.
Yeah, and the frustrating thing was, on all the table tests, they were like, "Yeah, it seems fine." They kept asking, like, "Does this hurt? Does this hurt?" And I was like, "No, it doesn't." But I'd try to getting up from like a low chair, and all of a sudden I'd feel this huge twinge, and it would hurt like hell, and I'd
Mm-hmm.
be like, "Okay, so like, how was your test valid if you couldn't recreate this very recreatable issue when I have weight on the ground?" I was a bit frustrated.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So what you're saying is when they did the table exam and you were sitting, I'm assuming you were sitting on the table or laying on the table?
Yeah, they had me lie on my back, and
Mhm.
they were kind of manipulating my leg and knee. They were
Mhm.
moving it around in different positions and
Mhm.
bending it and pushing it. And yeah, they weren't able to hit those
Gotcha.
pain receptors in that
Yeah, yeah.
position.
But then what you're saying is when you do stuff and you're in the vertical position with your feet on the ground,
Mm-hmm.
you are able to reproduce the pain.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I think what we'll do here is as we kind of talk through this stuff, anytime there's a moment where I can kind of go off a little bit to help people understand where my thinking might be
Yeah,
as
please.
as somebody's telling me this stuff, because as a movement professional, it's nice to kind of know where my mind might be, like where's my thinking. I know that for me, when I was learning how to interpret what people were telling me, I was always very interested in what other good practitioners were thinking as they were kind of
Mm-hmm.
downloading information.
Absolutely.
So first off, one of the things you said early on as we started talking about this was like currently, if you don't work out, it feels worse.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when I hear that, so actually, let me back up slightly and also kind of remind listeners and Tony, we're actually talking about chronic pain now. You
Mm.
actually fit the category of chronic pain because how long ago did the injury happen?
Yeah, like 15 months,
Yeah.
16 months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anytime, and I forget what the exact definition of chronic pain is, but it might actually be now. I think it's changed in the last couple of years or handful of years. I believe it's something like any pain that lasts longer than like 3 to 5 months, even after tissue damage has occurred.
Mm-hmm.
Once the tissue damage has had enough appropriate time to heal, if you're still dealing with pain, you're now considered somebody who has chronic pain. So right away, I'm sort of asking questions in my mind like, well, this injury was 15 months ago. Okay. So the time has passed that, tissue damage could have healed.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And obviously, no one's telling you that you've had, a complete tear or anything that you need surgical procedure on.
Right.
So in my mind, I'm like, all right, so why is Tony's brain still creating the output of pain
Mm-hmm.
on an injury that happened 15 months ago? Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
already I'm like, that's interesting. And one of the interesting thoughts I had was ligaments are the most nociceptively active tissue in the body,
Mm-hmm.
which means that they become highly sensitive to pain, essentially. And, well, threat receptors, right? I don't want to get people confused because there's no pain in Tony's knee. That's
Right.
the weird thing,
Right.
right? There's no pain in Tony's knee. The pain is an output that his brain has constructed because all of the incoming information that the brain is receiving is causing the brain to create this output of pain just because of threat.
Mm-hmm.
So when I talk to someone who's in a chronic pain state, I'm asking myself, what is the protective reason that this person is still in pain?
Mm-hmm.
Because chances are tissues are good now. And with ligaments, they have a tendency to not turn off that nociception. Nociceptors we call threat receptors. Those are the ones that are very much involved with the pain experience. because the more nociception that your brain is receiving, that's essentially telling your brain like, hey, there's a threat here. And ligaments have a hard time turning off their nociception after there's been some kind of problem there, whether it was a strain or a partial tear or something like that. So that's all interesting to me. And when you described your experience with your initial assessments, doing them on a table, when you're sitting on a table and you're lying on a table, those assessments that someone's doing to you are very passive in nature. So they're manipulating your leg. And it's in more of an open chain position, which essentially means you're not grounded. And gravity, your brain and your body's perception of gravity is completely different than when you are standing up vertically, where it sounds like you were experiencing a lot of your pain symptoms. And we talked about this in a different podcast where I discussed the table dilemma.
Yep.
The table dilemma is a massive problem in our current health industry because most therapies are done on a table, or most evaluations are done on a table, and they're done passively. What I mean by passively is another human being is moving your body, and in your case, trying to create the pain symptom. Now, that can offer information, but a lot of times it confuses things because you're experiencing your pain in a completely different position relative to gravity with completely different load on your body. So when you put someone on a table and you take them through that kind of passive assessment, you're actually assessing an entirely different nervous system than if you had them standing up and loading their body. So already we know the assessment process wasn't super specific for you, right? And so that's important to know as a health professional. The more assessments you can run in positions that are super specific to what the person is describing, the better.
Yeah.
So all your stuff was done in kind of an open chain position. So you're telling us that you actually are feeling more pain in a closed chain position when your feet are grounded and you do things like squats. And that is very common behavior from joints. A lot of times with joint pain, you'll find that in an open chain position, maybe there's no pain. In a closed chain position, there is pain. Or the other way around. I've had people feel fantastic with both feet on the ground, loaded. And as soon as they're in an open chain position, like with one leg up off the ground or something, they complain of pain. It can go both ways. So already, without even going too deep into this, I know that your training and your rehab, a lot of it has to be based around reducing threat in a closed chain position. And so that means we need both your feet on the ground, right, with your body loaded versus doing something without load or lifting your leg in the air, that kind of thing. So that's all quite important. Now, well, let's go back to your mechanism of injury, actually.
Okay.
You were talking about being on you're on a mat, right? And you're doing something in standing position. You step backwards and did something weird.
I think I stepped backwards. We were doing the drill where you are tagging each other's toes. If you tag the other person's toe, like,
oh yes,
kind of get a point.
Slap tag.
Slap tag, that's right. And it was super fun, and I was having a great time. And I think it was happening so fast, I don't remember exactly when what movement caused it. But then all of a sudden, I just lost stability in my knee and basically had to take a knee, and the drill had just ended. And so I was just sitting there while the coach was talking, just kind of internally assessing and freaking out a little bit.
Yeah.
And then I tried to stand up, and it just, you know, it was jelly. So yeah, that was the end of that session.
Yeah. You took a step into what I call the blind map. I actually was just describing this to our Neuro Dojo students recently. This is kind of interesting to think about, but most injuries happen in the blind map. So we've talked a lot about map clarity and moving your joints and coordinating learning how to coordinate all the joints in your body. We generally do that in various kinds of neutral positions, and oftentimes our arms and our legs are in front of our body, right? And you can even see the limb that you're moving when you are exercising. As soon as you cannot see the limb that you're moving, we call it the blind map. So imagine just like taking your arm and putting it behind you, or taking a very deep kind of backward step. Your leg is now in the blind map. And we call it the blind map because you can't see what's going on back there, even with your peripheral vision. And so as soon as you don't have your visual system to help you map your proprioception, levels of threat skyrocket. And a lot of people don't train their blind map. They don't train their motor control in those areas. And so the map that you have when your limbs are in front of your body in terms of coordination and strength is not the same map that you have when your limbs go behind your body. And go figure, most injuries actually happen in this blind map at end range of motion. So when you step back, for example, like with what happened to you, and you put a certain load on your knee, your brain's just not as capable of coordinating movement, in that place. And because it's in the blind map, it's just generally more threatening. And we just see more injuries happen in the blind map. So from a training perspective, right, what I would want to do with you in the long term is get you training your blind map. And so how that might look is still joint mobility exercises. You know that I love joint mobility exercises, and we need to load your knee, right, to keep conditioning it, building your tolerance back, and loading the ligament, right? The ligament needs load, and it's a more challenging load to get on that particular ligament area.
Yeah.
It's not like what I did 7 years ago. I partially tore my MCL, and my MCL became extra nociceptively active after the fact.
Ouch.
But I was able to do very direct manual work to it, like putting pressure on it while I was moving, which is quite useful. But in your case, it's different. It's not necessarily a place that you can easily get pressure towards. So we need to call on our joint mobility drills, and we need to start thinking about the tools that we could possibly use to help load those ligaments, because they need a very specific kind of load to shut off that nociception. At least experientially, that is what I have found with myself and with other people when ligaments are still misbehaving after 15 months. In a moment, I'll talk about what tools that might be. But with the blind map piece, what I would probably do with you is I would say, hey, you still got to do your knee circles, but we have to start doing them in some of our compass stances, which are, it's a template that we use that puts you in different lunge positions. And almost half of the lunge positions are technically in the blind map where you step backwards.
Yeah.
And so we have a few lunge positions. One is called the posterior 45 lunge. The other is called a posterior lunge. I bet if I showed you what they are, you'd say, hey, that's the position I got injured in. Because it's like, if you take a little step backwards, basically you're in a posterior lunge. And so we'd want to start moving you into that position safely and doing some of your joint mobility work, particularly things like our knee circles and our ball of foot circles, and getting good load through your knee. The other thought that comes up, there's a couple things that I think about when I'm thinking about ligaments. One of those things is called a floss band. If you're familiar with, like, it's like a latex sheet of, rubber material. Usually when you buy it, it comes in like a 6-foot roll, and it's 2.5 inches wide, and it's very thin. And you can take this stuff, it's essentially a rubber tourniquet, and you can wrap it around your joints. So if you were to use it on a knee, you would start kind of down on the upper shin, and then you would start wrapping it around the upper part of your calf, and then you'd begin to overlap the knee. And each time you wrap it, you use about a 50% overlap of the actual rubber.
Mm-hmm.
And you're putting it on tight. It's like tighter than you would ever want your clothes. Like it's almost uncomfortable tight, but it's not
Mm-hmm.
causing you pain.
Mm-hmm.
And so you wrap the floss band, as they're often called, around your knee, and you have pressure. And even though it's not direct pressure necessarily to that exact ligament you were talking about, it almost doesn't matter. We might not have to get that specific to do the receptor work that we want to do. We're creating pressure in general around the knee, and that could be quite useful in activating the receptors that usually need some work after a ligament type injury. Once the floss band is on, now you can start to perform your joint mobilizations, whether that's your knee circles in your posterior 45 lunge, like I mentioned, or any kind of squatting motions. You can really do it with anything. And of course, you're assessing and reassessing as you go to see which positions and which drills are having the most impact. And I will tell you, and this is important for our movement pros to hear, if you guys know our joint mobility system, a lot of the movements are circular in nature.
Mm-hmm.
You have to assess what direction you're going. It literally can be directionally specific. And you can put the voodoo floss on in a directionally specific way too. This is what a lot of people don't know. A lot of people use floss bands and they don't know this. Yeah. But you can wrap it clockwise or you could wrap it counterclockwise. If you wrap it the wrong way, it could make you worse. It's that specific, which is really interesting. But I've had more experiences than I can even remember at this point where we had to use directional specificity on the tools that we were applying. And so I always test which direction the nervous system is responding best to. So you throw the band on and find the right direction through assessing and reassessing your knee and some ranges of motion. Then you'd start to work through some of the drills, again, assessing and reassessing to see which ones and in which directions were giving you a good result.
Any theories as to why the direction of the wrap matters?
Yeah, I think it just comes down to perceived threat, right? So when you move the skin, lots of stuff underneath the skin moves too. There's a lot that we can't see, that we don't even know is really going on. But when you traction the skin, you are sensitizing lots of different nerve endings. Nerve endings that live in the skin, that live in the connective tissues, depending on the depth of the pressure, ligaments, tendons, things like that. And your nervous system can become super sensitive to the direction that you traction tissue. And I think a lot of that just has to do with the person's brain, their needs, their injury history.
Right.
If you traction the person's skin in a direction that happens to be threatening because of the position of injury,
right,
now your brain might be going, hey, last time this happened and all these receptors were giving us this information, something bad happened. So I don't like this. And levels of perceived threat will go up, and therefore you'll often see a person's assessments get worse, and they might even start complaining of pain symptoms. This is crazy to see when you see this real time in person. Like when I'm teaching people how to do more like manual type stuff, like basically assess to see what direction voodoo floss should go on, or kinesio tape, if you're familiar with that. You can actually put your hand on somebody's skin very lightly. You can traction their skin in any of the cardinal directions of a compass. So just a little bit of pressure, traction up, traction down, right, left. You've got some angles you can test. Every single direction that you pull the skin, literally we're talking maybe an inch or less at times of actual skin traction, you will get dramatically different results in all of their assessments.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is wacky to see this real time when you've never seen it before. And it makes you go, whoa, that means I have to be really specific with the kind of inputs that I use to try to help this person.
Yeah.
Because if I just assume that voodoo floss should be on their body, or kinesio tape should be on their body, or that I can manually manipulate their tissue with these manual skills that I have, if I just assume that that's healthy for you without testing it, I now could be getting a bunch of threat-based results that I don't know about.
Mm-hmm.
And it really makes it hard to make progress. So there is a way. This is really interesting, and we'll have to. I actually might have an old video I can dig up for you at some point, Tony. This is something I rarely. I generally only do this one-on-one with people, but I'll try to describe it.
Okay.
It's slightly difficult to describe and maybe visualize, but I think we'll be okay. So we know with your knee, we need to get load into the tissues, right? We need to do it in a safe way, but we need to create some stimulus that may not be happening right now with what you're doing. Ligaments respond a lot to torsional load.
Mm-hmm.
So like twisting forces,
Mm-hmm.
which kind of makes sense because their role is to make sure your bones don't get pulled apart. For example, when you step into a position like you described, and maybe you're at a very awkward range of motion, it just happened to be the right position that was threatening for your brain and body. Perhaps the torsional load on the ligaments was just, what was threatening.
Mm-hmm.
Your ligaments are designed to respond to those types of torsional loads, and they tell your brain, like, hey, this is either okay, or hey, this is a lot of force in an awkward position. We don't like it.
Mm-hmm.
Oddly enough, in your scenario, when even though you've had, in this case, like chronic pain after tissues have been able to heal, we often have to find ways to get torsional load back into the joint structure, and we have to get creative with it. If you can imagine this, our standard knee circle as a joint mobility drill. And yeah, we can do it with voodoo floss on the knee, and that's quite possibly could be a good way to go. However, I use this other technique where I set up 2 resistance bands, and they're relatively heavy, like a medium, the resistance bands that are like maybe, I don't know, a half inch to an inch wide.
Mm-hmm.
I think those are usually what people consider medium resistance.
And are these like the thin ones, or are these kind of the
They're
thicker ones that you
they're
use
closed loop, so they're roughly
Mhm.
like 41, 42 inches in diameter. So they're a loop, and then they're a half inch to an inch wide, but they're very thin.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know, maybe a quarter inch thick in terms of that thinness, but some people call them monster bands. What I like to do here is attach those 2 bands to anchor points. And for me, like at home, it's my squat rack.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to be able to put each end of the band on my leg that's going to be active. So in this case, it'll be the knee that we're working on. And I'm going to put one of those bands just below the knee, and I'm going to put the other band just above the knee.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And of course, make it all comfy and stuff. And because there's going to be a lot of torsion here, you don't want it ripping at your skin and causing pain.
Yeah, I find like wearing thin pants is nice.
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, and you can even do like a loop connection to your body, and it actually is even better for this technique. So
Oh, interesting.
you create a loop, and so instead of having just one strand of the band against your skin, you actually have 2,
Mhm.
because it's like a slip. The loop has the ability to slip and tighten up on your body, and that's actually a good thing. So we've got a band below the knee, just a
Mhm.
couple inches. We've got a band above the knee, just a couple inches. Now what we do is we back up away from our anchor point. So we've got a lot of resistance to work with. Both of these bands are stretching. And we've got to anchor both feet on the ground into a lunge position, which we call a forward 45 lunge. Both feet flat so that you're stable. Here's the part that really matters. We have to angle your body in a way so that you at least have these vectors of pull 90 degrees to one another.
Mm-hmm.
So by angling yourself within the squat rack or within whatever arrangement you're using with 2 anchor points, and by the way, your anchors have to be very strong
Mm-hmm.
because the force coming from the bands is huge. It's a lot. You're not going to do this with the kitchen table or you'll pull the table across the kitchen floor kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we actually want as much force as we can get as long as it's not causing any negative symptoms. So roughly 90 degrees apart from one another by angling yourself maybe 45 degrees inside or away from the squat rack. So now we've got a band pulling you one direction. We've got another band pulling you the other direction. And now
So the
go ahead.
bands are
Sorry.
on different posts? Just so I
Yes,
understand? Okay.
exactly.
Got it. Okay.
Exactly. And now you do your knee circles. And it is one of the most interesting ways to load your joints that actually is more like real life anyways, because
Mhm.
you have multiple vectors that are resisting you at the same time. When you do this, you actually start to realize, oh, most of the training I do is completely non-specific to life. Great. Because like we're always really interested in loading sort of one direction, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And as soon as you start incorporating multiple directions, it's like, wow, this is cool. This makes sense. So the point here is because of these bands pulling you at 90 degrees, it's creating torsional force on the knee. And it can be extremely stimulating for ligaments. Because remember, the ligaments have receptors within them that are becoming very active to the torsional loads.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, it's interesting because the opposing forces, it actually helps you feel more stable.
Right.
So a lot of times when you put somebody into this kind of band setup, the first thing they tell you is, wow, I thought this was going to be kind of like scary because of all the resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And now that I've got a band pulling me that way and a band pulling me this way, I actually feel like I'm more stable than I've ever been. And I like this feeling.
Yeah.
That's often what happens. So that is a technique that I use to progress our joint mobilization drills to a point where we can get enough torsional load to the ligament structures of a joint. And this works. I've done this with knees and with ankles and with elbows and with hips. And it's super fatiguing in a kind of a good way when you're doing it because you've got so much resistance to work with. And I've often even had people put on a floss band first. So
Oh,
you
wow.
wrap your knee. So you're
Yeah.
getting direct pressure on the knee. And then you enter the torsional band setup. And yeah, it can be really awesome. People walk away from doing one set and they're like, "Oh my gosh, I feel like I'm walking in the clouds." Like it does something to lighten your leg. It's an interesting feeling. And I should say too, if anyone ever explores this, so we want to try 90 degrees in terms of our band vectors, and we also want to try 180 degrees.
Okay.
That's a harder setup.
Yeah.
It's a harder setup because you need to get creative with your anchors and stuff, but you can do it. And sometimes I'll just do it inside my squat rack, but I'll shorten my bands. But same idea. You got 180 degrees, of opposing band resistance. And then you're doing in this case, your knee circles at the same time.
Does it matter whether above the joint or below the joint is forward or backwards? Is that something you would need to assess?
Yeah. I mean, it could. And oddly enough, I don't think I've had to go to that level of detail very much.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't recall that being as much of a factor. So they're just usually I've tested directions of the actual mobilization. That will matter. And other than that, just making the bands comfortable in the person so that they're not telling you that their skin is getting yanked on in
Yeah.
an uncomfortable way, because that'll just kind of start to skew assessments and make it unpleasant for somebody. But yeah, it is a cool little technique, and it's actually making me want to do this because I get a great response from it. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I can sort of imagine it. And, funny enough, one of the things that I feel is helpful that the PT prescribed was just putting one band above the joint and then hinging the knee.
Hmm.
So hinging the knee and then like walking back and then straightening against the force.
Yes, yeah, they're working on like your knee lockout, like your terminal
Yeah.
extension of the knee. Yeah.
Yeah. And so
Uh-huh.
that's one thing that helped because it did feel like it was putting pressure like through the joint
There
and
you
through
go.
the
It's the
ligament.
same. It's exactly what we're talking about. It's just not as torsional as
Yeah,
I would
not
like to go.
torsional.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So you could even do that same kind of thing, and that can be quite. That's a good range of motion that you really have to actually include in your rehab. So that's a good thing because with knee injuries, especially that kind of a ligament issue, you need to make sure that you're mapping lockout.
Yeah.
Yeah, because a lot of people with knee pain over time, their lockout map starts to go away. And then they become the person that's afraid to lock out their knee.
Interesting.
You don't want to be afraid of locking out your knee. It's not cool. It's not a good thing. And it takes some time to earn back, but it can be earned back. And actually, what we're talking about here is a good way to work on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like that was really helpful. It was one of the things that I noted was one of the better assessments. So I'm
Cool.
excited to try with more
Yep.
torsional force.
Yep. And you were closed chain when you did it, I imagine. Your foot was on the
Mm-hmm.
ground? Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
Perfect.
Yep. And then the other thing that I wonder if this was applying torsional force or not was
Mm-hmm.
she'd have me do body squats, but with a band, me putting my feet in the band on the floor. And
Mm-hmm.
so the band is trying to like pull my feet together
Mm-hmm.
and I'm having to apply force outwards
Mm-hmm.
to maintain my stance as I squat.
Yep.
And I wondered, is that applying torsional force from the bottom almost or
It does, yeah. It offers some. It offers some, but it's not as far as targeting the type of receptor that we're talking about. It is not that load is not focused enough on the target area
Mhm.
to check that box.
Yeah.
It might be good for something else, but
I think
it wouldn't be what we would do to target the ligament specifically.
yeah. Yeah, I was just curious if there was some carryover there. I think part of the rationale for that was because I had started avoiding like I would angle my foot as I
Hmm.
would be walking or going up
Hmm.
the stairs or something. And so I think she was trying to, correct
Yep.
that a little bit to get my body used to.
Are you still angling that foot?
So that's what I notice is when I'm not doing that rehab stuff
Hmm.
and I'm not working out consistently enough that I notice my toe wants to move in and my heel wants to kind of move out. It like
Oh,
angles
interesting.
like toes in a little
Yeah,
bit
like
and
pigeon toe kind of
a
thing.
little bit.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Do you think that is that a result of, or do you feel like that could have been your posture before the injury?
Oh, this is this is where these histories get really interesting, right?
Yeah.
Cuz I've also noticed in this process and it's something that I've had for a long time and I never really thought about it, but my big toe on that same leg,
Hmm.
sometimes I'll like step and like the toe will push up or something and it will cause some pain.
Mm.
And so I think I've been subconsciously avoiding that position with that toe probably for years.
Oh,
And
interesting.
I wonder if it was soccer and I like kind of like had a micro fracture or something and never
Mm.
it just never also never healed. So
Interesting.
that's just something that I kind of realized once I was doing rehab was like, oh, now that there's this toe thing that maybe I'm noticing more now. Maybe that was actually a precursor.
In which side of your body is this knee issue?
This is all on my right leg
On your
and my
right leg.
right
Okay,
knee.
cool. You're right hand dominant.
That's correct.
Yeah, and so are you generally less coordinated on your left side? If you had to guess.
Yeah, like when it comes to like brushing my teeth or like
Yeah, yeah,
playing an instrument, yeah, my right hand's definitely better. But I don't know that I've ever tracked like foot or
yeah.
any other part of my body on
Sure.
that side.
Yeah. Totally random. Well, not random to me, but it will sound random to you.
Sure.
I don't know if you ever take your blood pressure,
Hmm.
but have you ever taken your blood pressure on either side or both sides?
I've never
And
done both sides, so I actually got a mutual friend, Jordan Syatt,
yeah,
who actually introduced me to you.
yeah, yeah.
He's very big on like, hey, get a blood pressure monitor and like do that. So I should probably be testing that more actively. But I got one, so I have
Yeah,
one at
that's
home. So I
okay.
should,
Cool. Great.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
that's
should do
great
that.
advice. Yeah, I know Jordan talks a lot about blood pressure. That's awesome. One of the things you can do is take your blood pressure on both sides. So this is so for our movement pros, just to give you an idea of some of the initial assessments that I would run with Tony. Because just so people know, my thought process is when somebody comes to me with a pain issue, I want to try to help them to some degree that day. And so if Tony and I were together doing a session, I would likely be doing what I just described with him
Right.
and assessing and reassessing, trying to give him an experience that he could get engaged with through our assessment process, and trying to find a drill that was more localized to his problem.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is a little bit different topic, but as a movement professional, you have to be cautious of giving a person, especially on day one, what you know they need versus what they actually want. And so if Tony and I are just meeting and he's never really done any of this neuro stuff that I do, he's interested, but he hasn't had that experience, I can't just immediately go and do all of these weird neuro drills for his visual system and his vestibular system necessarily. What he's really looking for is something that feels super actionable and specific to his problem.
Yeah.
So at first, I would actually rather do something localized, like, hey, Tony, your knee hurts. Let's work on your knee today. But what I really know is we're going to have to do much more than just working on your knee.
Yeah.
But as you follow up and we continue the process, now I'm just starting to sprinkle on some other things that I know are going to be important.
Yeah.
So in knowing that, I'm also taking some initial assessments, and they're neuro assessments, but they're super fast and they help me get a bunch of information fast. One of the things I would do is a cerebellar assessment, which is a type of coordination assessment that essentially tells us whether you are more or less coordinated on one side of your body.
Mm-hmm.
And we do that with these rapid type movements where I'll say, okay, I want you to, tap your hand as fast as you can for 6 seconds on the right. Now do it on the left. Let's compare sides. Tap your foot, right and left. Let's compare sides. And we're trying to figure out, do you have a cerebellar deficit on either side of your body? And then the other thing I'm doing is I'm doing a gait assessment, and I'm looking at some postural stuff during gait. And we can draw out a lot of patterns from that too. That's going to be a whole separate podcast, I'm sure, at some point. So I would do a gait assessment. And if I started seeing some certain things in gait that represent what we would consider a PMRF pattern, which is abbreviates a really cool, sophisticated thing called the pontomedullary reticular formation. And that is the brainstem.
Say that 3 times fast.
Yeah, exactly. So when someone has a PMRF pattern in gait, it presents with a specific posture. Oftentimes, the lower body limbs are outwardly rotated, or at least one of them is. So think about like a duck foot, either one duck foot or 2 duck feet. And then the upper body, the limbs could be rotated in, and they could show excessive flexion tendencies, like the elbow might be flexed a little bit, the wrist might be flexed a little bit, even the hand. I'm drawing out information from that. This is a neurologic gait assessment. And if I start to get suspicious that a person might have a PMRF pattern on, let's say, just one side of the body, then I might do something a bit more in that category, and taking blood pressure on both sides of the body would be something that I would do. And the reason being is that if your blood pressure happens to be, let's say, a little higher on one side, which we often see when we take it bilaterally, usually what we say is 10 points higher or more, that is often going to go with this PMRF pattern. So the reason this all matters is because neurologically, as we start to look at a person, if we find that, let's say, Tony has less coordination on his left side as a whole, because of the way our neurology of movement works, a left-sided cerebellar deficit, so that means coordination deficit, could lead to right side cortical and or PMRF deficits. So that is useful information for me to know right away, because let's say we find that you have a right PMRF problem. The PMRF, this was the fancy word I said, which is the brainstem, is responsible for reflexive stabilization of the body. So that's the kind of stability that you need as an athlete or to do anything that you don't think about.
Right.
It just happens. We have neural circuitry that does it. So, for example, when you hurt your knee, when you step backwards on that leg, if you don't have appropriate reflexive stabilization, that could lead you to an injury. It also has a lot to do with the balance of muscle tone. So if you don't have good reflexive stabilization and you have some kind of muscle tone imbalance there, too much, too little, something like that, that could also lead to a possible injury there. So these are the initial assessments that I'm doing on day one to try to pattern a person as best I can. And then I sort of run their history through this filter. And maybe we're talking in a history and we find out that you actually have more of a history of right-sided pain and injury on that side of your body. That also it tips me off that it could be a right PMRF related issue. So that's kind of how, I want to get that information right away, because it helps me start to then figure out what other neuro tools could I possibly use. But here's the thing that I'm getting at. It also tells me why localized work might not be working for you. Okay. So this is, and granted, like I'm making some assumptions right now because we haven't done the assessment. So I don't know what your pattern actually is. But this is important for people to understand, because a lot of people are in Tony's position where tissue has healed. 15 months later, they're better, but they're not completely better. And then when you ask them what they've been doing, everything they've been doing is very localized work.
Right.
Meaning, yeah, we're doing stuff with the knee, which has to happen, but sometimes we have to approach it differently. Here's why. Let's say you do have this right PMRF problem, and that is part of the reason why you got an injury to a ligament, because you weren't as stable as you needed to be. If we do localized work to your knee, like all the stuff that I recommended, right? Floss bands, torsional band setups, knee circles, all that stuff, all that sensory input on that right side is going to go to your left cortex. It's going to eventually end up in the left cortex. And if the left cortex is doing its job well, it's going to fire down into that left PMRF. So you have a right and a left brainstem, right and left PMRF. And now we are sending input to the opposite PMRF and stabilizing the wrong side of the body. Okay. So this is why, as a brain-based practitioner, it really pays to understand some neurology, because if all we ever do is create sensory input at the site of injury, from a brain-based perspective, we're training the wrong side of your brain. And yes, some local stuff might be taking place there. We might be building some strength, and that's good, and maybe enhancing some proprioception. But if you have a PMRF issue, it's not fixing your reflexive stabilization problem, because reflexive stabilization comes from the brain. And for a right PMRF problem, we have to work on your right cortex. And we have to work on your right PMRF. Okay, so it's possible that, because I see this so much, you've done 20 to 40% of the work locally. Like you've gotten this result that is good. It's 20 to 40% of the equation, but now we have to start utilizing other neuro tools to train your right cortex and your right PMRF, because that's where your reflexive stabilization is going to come from, and your brainstem's ability to balance muscle tone better.
Mm-hmm.
So this is where it just gets fun and cool as a neuro guy, because now we have to start looking at your visual system.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have to start looking at your inner ear, your vestibular system, maybe some other things like cranial nerves. There's a lot of different tool sets that we could use to start to target your right cortex and your right PMRF. And oddly enough, from a sensory standpoint, we'd have to do the sensory stuff on the left side of your body.
Interesting. Yeah.
Which is always weird for people, but like I might say, all right, Tony, I turn on my, massage gun or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, hold this in your left hand. Now do your knee circles, right? So now we're generating sensory input on your left side that is going to eventually end up in your right cortex.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually that's going to act on your right PMRF.
Mm-hmm.
And now as you do your knee circles, holding the vibration in your left hand, you might all of a sudden start to feel more stable at your right knee. And maybe you can move better as a result. And maybe your pain is going down as you do it. This is really fun to experience and see. And the vibration on the left is just one of endless possible inputs. But the sensory ones, if we were to use them more in more of a targeted fashion, we'd start exploring it on the other side of the body.
So like left eye, left hearing, left ear.
So you're going much higher order with that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That is, I'm talking more tactile.
Okay.
So vibration on the skin, floss bands to create pressure, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Once we start talking about the eyes and the inner ear and the cranial nerves, it gets much more specific. But so, for example, let's say we wanted to use sound as an input to possibly help your right side from a stabilization perspective. We would put the sound in your right ear.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. If we wanted to use like trigeminal nerve as a possible input, I would have you bite something between your right molars. All right. So there's several different cranial nerves that insert directly into the PMRF. And by activating those cranial nerves, we can upregulate the PMRF and also possibly get some help with reflexive stabilization.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's really a fun thing to apply with neuro, because it's actually really easy too.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually just talking to one of our neuro dojo students who had a really cool experience in the gym. She was having problems pressing a kettlebell overhead and
Mm-hmm.
had like a chronic shoulder issue that was bothering her. And she, if I remember correctly, she used trigeminal nerve input by biting something between her molars on that side. And there was one other thing she added to it that escapes me right now, is another kind of input. And anyways, she was able to immediately press with no pain, and now she's been able to practice that.
That's ninja stuff, man.
Yeah, it's so crazy and wild. Like, it never really gets old when you see it and hear about it. But that would be an example of how we would approach neuro drilling, which again, for our movement pros, remember, this comes after I've got Tony's buy-in.
Right.
The way I'm going to work with Tony to start is, hey, your knee hurts. Let's do something with your knee.
Yeah. If you're a practitioner and
Yep.
someone comes in off the street, hey, I've got shoulder pain, the first thing you do isn't going to be like, hey, chew on this. And,
exactly.
Tickle your left side.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Unless I'm trying to impress some people at a party and I want to do some cool neuro tricks and it's like you got to be careful with what you do the first couple times with somebody, because that time is really for building rapport and helping them. But you're probably going to have to go deeper, mm-hmm. and they don't know that yet. Mm-hmm. The real world is used to, hey, I have knee pain. I got to go do knee stuff and only knee stuff.
Yeah. But
there's a very large percentage of people that end up in the position you're in, where they've done a lot of knee stuff, mm-hmm. but the job's not done. And so we got to start expanding our thinking and working with some of these higher order systems. So that's kind of how I would be thinking about this. And again, I was making some assumptions with Tony and his pattern, but that's why we run these neurologic assessments with cerebellar testing and PMRF testing and all the stuff that we do so that we can try to figure out how to work the underperforming systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
And essentially train a lot of the reflexive part of what happens or what's supposed to take place with movement.
Yeah.
Because most people's training and rehabilitation is based off of the voluntary components. And that is just a very small percentage of how movement actually works when we look at these different reflexive systems. So my thought is right now, there may be some reflexive stuff that needs to get done for you,
Mm-hmm.
in addition to offering those ligament structures more stimulus that you haven't had yet.
Yeah. A quick question about
Yes.
reflexive stabilization.
Yeah.
For kettlebell presses, one arm kettlebell presses, one of the
Hmm.
techniques that I learned was like, let's say I'm pressing with my right arm,
Yep.
is to like create tension, like ball my fist with my left
Yep.
arm and like really create tension on the left side of the body.
Yeah.
Now, I just assumed that was just like literal stabilization
Yep.
of like all the muscles are tight, so you have
Yep.
nowhere to go. Would this actually have like a neurological component
It does. Yeah.
as well?
That's really good thinking. I think most people assume that's what it's doing, and to some level, it is because you're creating tension in the body to help give you a stronger platform to press off of.
Mm-hmm.
So there is some of that going on. But for example, when you make a fist with your left hand, that is a voluntary movement. You've made the decision to create that tension. And that decision making and activation is coming from your right cortex,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because of the way that voluntary movement is created. If you move your left side, that's coming from your right cortex.
Mm-hmm.
So by making a voluntary movement like clenching your left fist, you're activating your right cortex, and your right cortex is going to fire down into your right PMRF. So a really simple thing that I sometimes do with people when I'm kind of in a rush and I'm doing assessments is, let's say, like, you're showing me that when you squat your right knee hurts.
Mm-hmm.
I might say, hey, make a fist with your left hand and squeeze it really hard, and now squat. And you're like, oh, that's funny. The pain went from a 7 to a 5. Does that matter? I'm like, yep, that matters, because that tells me, oh, what if we do more right side cortical work with him?
Yeah.
Is that gonna help that right PMRF? And that's just a really fast like screening that I can do just to get clues.
I can't believe I haven't thought of trying that yet.
Try
That's
it.
awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, try it. That'll be a really cool thing for you to explore. Have you heard me talk yet about opposing joint theory?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So another thing to try would be left elbow mobilizations.
Mm-hmm.
Your opposing joint for the right knee is going to be the left elbow. So possibly doing some of our elbow drills. If you go on my YouTube page, you can find elbow top circle,
Mm-hmm.
elbow bottom circle, and elbow figure eights.
Mm-hmm.
And you could try those unloaded, but you could also load them with a band, right, to make it harder and a little bit more fun, really.
Mm-hmm.
But that extra stimulus might be exactly what you need, because athletic people and people who have a pretty good history of training, they often need more stimulus for their brain to like really pay attention. So using like a band or something like that might be useful. But if you do left side elbow mobilizations using a band, now you're speaking to your right cortex again,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe that right PMRF, and you might be getting some opposing joint theory results, which are really cool. There's other circuitry that we have that's more related to like human gait cycle,
Mm-hmm.
but the PMRF is also involved in it, and so that's why opposing joint theory can be so useful. I mean, when that stuff works, it works so good, it's wild. When it doesn't work, it just doesn't work. Like you're looking for a clue. Like if it
Right.
helps you a little bit, it's worth pursuing. If it doesn't help, it's generally not worth staying with it.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty easy to figure out because it's very truthful in its in the way that a person assesses. But that'd be another thing to consider.
Yeah. So, session one, we're really drilling down on this knee and trying to figure out some high payoff
Yes.
drills with assessments to verify that.
Yep. And actually, let me actually add one thing to that, Tony. Again, because I know we have so many movement professionals listening. What happens on day one is probably the most important part of the process with somebody. And I'm always talking about assessing and reassessing, like range of motion, whatever it is that we use. Range of motion is generally what I teach people at first. It is very important for me to have an experience with Tony where his range of motion either gets better or gets worse. I don't really
Mm-hmm.
care which one. Like, I'm most definitely going to find something that makes it better. But even if it makes it worse, that is important for Tony to learn too,
Mm-hmm.
because your client at that point is starting to engage a completely new process where they are involved. Most of the stuff that people do for rehab, they're not involved.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you just see a practitioner and they're like, this is what we're doing today.
Yeah.
A lot of times it's what the last person did, right? And it's just like, that's the reality of what most people are getting for rehab. Not everybody is amazing therapists out there, but they're just harder to find. So day one's very important because I need Tony to have an experience where something changes. And all of a sudden his brain can go, oh, wait, you mean I get to be a part of this? And not only that, how did that drill make me better? And my pain, let's say, went from a 5 to a 3.
Mm-hmm.
Because as soon as you get that buy-in with somebody, we talked about neuroplasticity on a different podcast, and I said salience of, the ability to get that person's brain and nervous system to want to prioritize the process and to get them interested in the process. That is the key to long-term results when you're trying to help another human. And they have to know why you're doing these things. So I like to include some education, with every session. Like, this is what we're going to try. We don't know what's going to happen. Here's my thought process between, with why we're trying this. And we start local just so that Tony can feel like he's working on his problem. But then as we get follow-up and even more buy-in, now we're starting to move towards some of those neuro tools that could really help with more of a long-term result.
Yeah, and just speaking from my own experience, this kind of chronic pain or this feeling that, it's like, man, it just doesn't work as well as it used to.
Yeah.
You really feel helpless.
Yes.
You really feel like, man, this is out of my control, and like,
Mm-hmm.
is this just going to be like this forever?
Yes.
And so I totally get that. Seeing some results immediately and having some actionable information that can improve that perspective, that psychology is really valuable to the client. It's like a
Totally.
ray of hope,
It
and
is.
and
We
they're
call
going to latch onto
neuroscience.
that.
Yeah, we call neuroscience the science of hope.
Oh wow.
It's a science of hope, and it's just awesome when you can see a person engage the process, and all of a sudden, yeah, they learn that the coach is listening, right? And they are going to get different outcomes on the things that they try. And now we've empowered that person to be able to test it for themselves. It's a level of being engaged and involved in the process that most people have never felt before, because they've always felt like they're going to a practitioner and just checking off the box. And then it's kind of like, well, I hope I did the healthy thing I was supposed to do, and I hope it works. And what we're now saying is, no, no, no. You get to experience if it's working, and you get to experience it today, not in 3 months. And we're going to mark our findings and get those clues and follow those clues. I never put a person in a position where it's like, okay, this is the routine we're going to do. Let's see how you're doing in 12 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, we want to see how you're doing in 12 weeks, but I'm more interested in how you're doing right now with each input that we're using.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be easy to go 12 weeks down the wrong rabbit hole, right?
Yeah. People do it all the time, just following routines and not assessing and reassessing. when you're in pain, you have to know what the outcome is. You have to know how your body's responding. When you're training, it's different, right? Training is more about building tolerance,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's actually what we call threat inoculation
Mm-hmm.
versus threat reduction. Threat
Interesting.
reduction is putting the right inputs together to make your nervous system and brain feel safe about moving. And threat inoculation is the opposite. We're actually purposely handing you threats and we're telling your nervous system, hey, learn how to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're doing it in a thoughtful way, and we're still leaning on some of the threat reduction and those other high payoff drills. But ultimately, we're trying to build you a bigger threat bucket,
Yeah.
right? But in the threat reduction phase, we're trying to empty the threat bucket that you have.
When you put it that way in that language, it makes me wonder if the recovery industry is really just like a byproduct of the threat inoculation process. It's like, oh, you're going to do HIIT or CrossFit, or
Yep.
you're going to strength train as heavy as possible. And so now we need to do all this stuff to reduce the threat that you just raised to create a change.
Yeah, that is an interesting way to think about it. It really is. That's how I think about training in general. And that's how I think about rehab. It's, with rehab, it's okay. What is the protective reason behind the output that this person's brain is giving us? And from there, how do we empty the threat bucket to provide the person's brain more of a level of safety? Because if we can create more safety, then as a result, immediately you're going to move better and with less pain. And we're going to do that for a while. But then strategically, we're just going to start adding more threat inoculation because, yeah, we need to improve your tolerance at some point and start to give you more conditioning in a sense, which would kind of be the
Mm-hmm.
next phase of what you would have to do. And I know that's of interest to you.
Mm-hmm.
Is eventually it's more about like conditioning. How do I condition my body and train it so that the next time I want to do jujitsu and I step backwards and my
Mm-hmm.
leg is at exactly that awkward angle, which is bound to happen, at a higher speed and in the blind map,
Mm-hmm.
are you now conditioned and do you own the map to be able to tolerate that position that you were forced into,
Yeah.
really? And that's that next phase.
Yeah. Well, this is amazing. I know that there's so much more we could cover in this conversation in terms
Totally.
of other rabbit holes to go down in history, assessments that we couldn't do since we're not in person and this is not a video. But
Right.
I think that was super valuable insight into what this process can look like. Do you have any final thoughts on this session in particular, taking a history in general?
The only thing is for the movement professionals, if you're not taking a thorough history, you need to start doing it. What I've noticed is that history taking in general is just something that most people never even experience. It's kind of weird. You go to the doctor and no one takes your history. Not the type of history we're discussing anyway.
Yeah.
I'll be honest with you. My personal belief is your history is not taken anywhere else in terms of getting this detailed because nobody necessarily expects to help you out and they don't necessarily expect you to follow up. And so it's kind of a trap. And it's just the way that the industry has become, right? And it's unfortunate. So especially when you're trying to work with somebody and you're trying to get real help, one of the telltale signs that you're going to get real help is if that person is actually taking your history.
Hmm.
So be careful if no one takes your history because what they're saying is, I don't need to know anything about you in order to help you. And that goes against everything we know about humans,
Yeah.
especially since we're all different. So if you want to be a good practitioner, coach, personal trainer, whatever it is, start taking people's history to learn more about them even if it's just in little increments at a time. And that's actually a very valuable way to do it that doesn't make it boring for your client base. But you will get good at interpreting what a person is telling you over time. You'll be able to run it through your own filter, and it will help you make much faster decisions. And you won't feel like what you're doing is random, because that's what I really struggled with early on in my career. Is it always felt like what I was doing was random because I didn't actually know enough about that person, and I wasn't able to run that history through a filter and make my decisions based on that. So start the history taking process. You will be thrilled at where it takes you. And over time, you will start to recognize patterns as well that can be quite useful in helping get people the results that they deserve in a short amount of time.
Yeah. And hopefully for the people that are not coaches or trainers that are listening, you're thinking about your own history
Yeah.
in new ways and maybe trying to find clues in these podcasts about what could, help you with your pain and your training and your movement.
Yes, so true. Thank you. All right. There it is. Thank you, Tony. And thank you to our listeners. I hope you guys enjoyed that piece on history taking. If you are interested in continuing your education with all of this cool applied neuro stuff, we do have a good opportunity coming up in the next couple of weeks. We're going to be opening the doors to the dojo, which is our monthly membership. And the only way that you will know that we're doing this is if you're on our email list, because we're not actually advertising this to the public. So make sure that you are on the email list. You can do that a number of different ways. You can just visit the show notes to find the links to our website. You can put yourself on the wait list for the dojo, and we'll send you emails with all the information that you need. If you're a movement professional, you don't want to miss this opportunity. Maybe you're somebody that wanted to do the Neuro Dojo this time around, but something got in the way and you couldn't do it. This would be your opportunity to get involved with what we're doing at a very low cost. And the way that we are running our membership now is we're starting to go more towards neuro education. So yes, we still have all the stuff in there that you can do as far as structured programs go for yourself, like mobility training and strength training. But what we've added now is a bunch of education for the movement professionals and the lifelong fitness enthusiasts, so that you guys can learn applied neurology in bits and pieces. And all of that stuff is something that we do constant education with. We're going to be running essentially monthly workshops where I'm going to be going live teaching about specific topics like how do you train your visual system? We'll do a whole month dedicated to that. How do you train your vestibular system? Whole month dedicated to that. And we'll go through so many different topics. So we're really looking forward to that. So get yourself on the wait list so that we can send you information, and hopefully we'll see you on the inside. And thank you guys so much for your support and for listening.